Watch a child. Watch how they laugh at a joke they don't understand yet, not because it's funny, but because their father laughed, and somewhere in their nervous system they've already learned that mirroring the person with power is safer than being confused out loud. Watch the hesitation before they ask a question, that half-second pause, the quick scan of the room, the calculation happening in a brain that's barely formed. Is it safe to be curious right now? Or should I already know this? Will asking make them sigh? Will it make them look at me like I'm a problem? Watch how they make themselves smaller in real time, shoulders in, voice down, presence dialed back, because at some point, being too much produced a reaction they didn't want to produce again. Watch how they hold their fork exactly the way their mother holds hers. Exactly. You are not watching a child develop. You are watching a human being get formatted, overwritten. And the people doing it? They call it parenting. They call it love. They genuinely believe that. That's the part nobody wants to say at dinner. Most parents are not raising children. They are reproducing themselves, taking a consciousness that arrived in the world genuinely free, asking why about everything, touching what they're told not to touch, crying without apology, laughing without checking if the room approves, and slowly, patiently, lovingly grinding it into a shape that's easier to manage, a shape that fits, a shape that doesn't make anyone uncomfortable. And then they wonder why their adult child is hollow. A child enters the world as something close to a philosopher, not a cute one, a real one. They ask why without embarrassment. Why is the sky that color? Why do you go to work if you hate it? Why do we have to pretend grandma's cooking is good? They have no investment in comfortable answers. They want actual ones. They touch things they're told not to touch because they want to understand temperature, texture, consequence. Because the only way to learn what a thing is to interact with it directly, not to be told about it from a safe distance. They feel everything without apology, rage, joy, grief, wonder, not because they haven't learned self-control, but because they haven't yet learned that their emotional reality makes adults uncomfortable, that the genuine version of themselves is inconvenient. Then it gets corrected, not cruelly, that's the important part, not with malice, with love. With the most sincere and destructive form of love, the kind that can't tolerate watching a child struggle, fail, be confused, be different, be themselves. The kind of love that sands down every rough edge until the child fits neatly into the box everyone else already lives in. Nietzsche called it domestication, the breaking of a wild thing until it's manageable. Most parents don't recognize themselves in that description. They should. Here's what nobody's honest enough to say. Most people cannot afford children and have them anyway. Not afford in the abstract, existential sense. Afford in the actual, concrete, what is in your bank account sense. People who cannot pay their own rent. People who are one car breakdown away from crisis. People drowning in debt they accumulated trying to feel okay about their own lives. People who haven't resolved their own psychological wreckage, who haven't figured out who they are, who haven't built anything stable, and then they decide, in the middle of all of that, to create a human being who will depend entirely on them. And then we act like pointing this out is cruel. The cruelty is not the observation. The cruelty is bringing a child into financial instability and then spending 18 years passing that instability, the anxiety, the scarcity, the chronic low-grade panic of not having enough, directly into that child's nervous system. Children raised in financial stress don't just experience the stress, they become it. It rewires how they process safety, risk, relationships, their own worth. The research on this is not subtle, but we don't say that because people get offended, because reproduction is treated as a sacred right above critique, above examination, above the basic question of whether you are actually prepared to do this to another human being. A dog breeder gets scrutinized more carefully than a human parent. Think about that. The child doesn't get to choose whether they're born into chaos. They don't get to choose the parents, the money, the neighborhood, the psychological health of the household. They arrive, and whatever is there, that's their whole world. That's what forms them. And if what's there is two people who can't afford them, who are stressed beyond their capacity, who are fighting about money every other week, who are modeling scarcity and resentment and quiet desperation, that child is being educated, just not in the way anyone admits. The lesson is, the world is not safe. Resources run out. Love has conditions. Your presence is a burden, and you should probably make yourself smaller to take up less of it. But the financial damage is almost secondary to the psychological damage, because poor parents can raise extraordinary children if they're honest.
The problem is when they're not. The problem is the four things almost every parent teaches, not on purpose, not because they're bad people, but because they were taught the same things and never stopped to examine them. The first is obedience, not reasoned respect, not cooperation built on understanding, reflexive, automatic, stop thinking and comply obedience. When an authority speaks, you silence yourself. Sit down, be quiet, don't ask why. Why is not a question, it's a challenge, and challenges are disrespectful. At 3 years old, when the kid is about to touch a hot stove, fine, obedience keeps them alive. But the lesson never updates, it calcifies. It becomes permanent architecture in their psychology. And the child grows into an adult whose nervous system is still wired for one thing: find the authority figure and comply. Boss says jump, they ask how high. Government says this is normal, they accept it. Doctor says this is how it is, they don't question it. The crowd says this is true, they believe it. They never once learned how to think independently because independent thought was trained out of them before they could tie their shoes. And now they're 43 years old in a job that's making them sick, in a relationship that's been dead for years, unable to make a single decision that wasn't pre-approved by some external authority, and they have no idea why they feel like they're not living their own life. They aren't. They never were. They were formatted to live someone else's. The second is conditional worth. They push grades, they push achievement, they push the resume, the credentials, the respectable path. Not because they want the child to be fulfilled, let's be honest about this, but because they need the child to perform well enough that the parents don't feel like failures. The child's achievements are the parents' social proof. Their grades are the parents' defense against judgment. Their success is what the parents point to when someone asks if they did a good job. And the child absorbs every bit of this. They learn that love has fine print, that approval is earned, not given, that their worth is a performance. Do it well enough and you're acceptable. Fall short and something fundamental about you is wrong. Do you understand what this creates? Walk into any corporate office and you will see the result. Adults, fully grown, professional, accomplished, who are still desperately trying to earn approval from parents who are dead. Still running the same performance, still measuring their worth in external metrics, still collapsing inside when someone criticizes their work because that criticism feels like what it always felt like. You are not enough. The hunger for approval that this creates is not something you can fill, because it was never actually about achievement. It was about a child who wanted to be loved without conditions and was never given that, and who has spent their entire adult life trying to earn it from people who cannot give it. The third is emotional burial. Don't cry, don't be too much, too loud, too weird, too sensitive. Whatever is genuinely you, dial it back, make it more comfortable for others to be around. Boys get this beaten into them overtly. Girls get it in quieter, more surgical ways. The raised eyebrow, the slight withdrawal, the you're being dramatic, but they get it just as thoroughly. The child who feels deeply is told again and again that they are feeling wrong, that their interior life is excessive, that authenticity is a social liability, and so they learn to present a surface to the world, controlled, acceptable, fine, while everything real goes underground. And then we express confusion. We actually act baffled. Why can't adults process their emotions? Why do they explode over nothing? Why are they so disconnected from what they actually feel or want? Because they spent their entire childhood learning that the real version of themselves was unacceptable. They buried it, professionally, thoroughly. And then the burial site gets forgotten, and decades later they're sitting in a therapist's office trying to excavate something they can't even locate anymore because they covered it so well. The exploding over nothing is not nothing. It's everything they swallowed for 30 years finding a crack to come out of. The fourth is the most lethal. The group is always right. Consensus equals truth. If everyone believes it, it probably is real. If you're the only one who sees a problem, you are the problem. A child who internalizes this, really internalizes it in their bones, will never be capable of holding a correct position in isolation. They need the crowd's permission before they're allowed to think. They poll the room before committing to a feeling. They check social media to find out what they're supposed to believe about something before they've allowed themselves to actually believe anything. They mistake popularity for correctness. They mistake isolation for error. And when something true but unpopular occurs to them, a genuine insight, a real observation, something the crowd hasn't approved yet, they dismiss it, swallow it. It's uncomfortable to be the only one who sees something, and they learned early that discomfort means stop. This is how you manufacture a person who will never threaten the existing order, who will never challenge anything that matters, who will spend their entire life being reliably, predictably, uselessly normal.
The parent who cannot think for themselves cannot raise a child who can. This is not a metaphor, it is a literal constraint. You cannot model something you have never practiced. You cannot teach a child to question if you have never questioned. You cannot show a child what courage looks like if you have spent your entire life avoiding anything that required it. And most people have spent their entire lives in careful, sensible, risk-managed avoidance of anything that would require them to actually examine themselves. Their beliefs were handed to them, their values were inherited, their choices, the job, the relationship, the life, were made by a process of social gravity more than genuine decision. They went where the current took them and called it living. And now they're trying to raise children, and the only material they have to work with is themselves, their unexamined assumptions, their unprocessed wounds, their unchallenged fears. So that's what the child gets. Not because the parent is malicious, they're not. They love this child more than anything. But love without self-awareness is just damage with good intentions. And good intentions do not protect a child from inheriting your wounds. They just mean the wounding happens in a warmer room. The child doesn't inherit your strength, they inherit the scar tissue, the flinch, the specific shape of your fear, without any of the context that might make it make sense. They just wake up one day in their 20s anxious about something they can't name, limited in ways they can't explain, and they assume it's just who they are. It's not who they are, it's who they were made to be. And underneath all of it, the money is still there, doing its quiet damage. A parent under financial stress is not fully present. They are calculating, they are worried, they are rationing attention and patience because both are finite, and the job and the bills and the debt are consuming enormous amounts of both. The child experiences this as absence, as conditional warmth, as a parent who is physically there but somehow not there, and who becomes frightening when the money conversation happens, which it does regularly, in raised voices or in the specific silence that is somehow louder than raised voices. The child doesn't have the framework to understand this. They can't think, my parents are financially overwhelmed. They think, something is wrong and it might be me. They think, I need to be smaller so there's less of a problem. They think, I need to perform better so they're proud of me and the tension goes away. And here is the thing that needs to be said plainly and without softening. Having a child you cannot afford is not a neutral act. It is not a private decision that affects only you. It is a decision that creates a human being who will spend years of their most formative psychological development inside your financial crisis, who will absorb your stress as their baseline understanding of what the world is, who will build their entire model of safety, scarcity, love, and worth inside a household that cannot actually support them. People will call this cruel to say. It is far more cruel to not say it and let it keep happening. The decision to have a child is the largest ethical act most people will ever perform. It creates an entirely new person who did not consent to existing and who has no power whatsoever over the conditions they're born into. And we treat it with less seriousness than buying a used car, less scrutiny than getting a dog. We treat it as a biological impulse that doesn't require justification, examination, or even basic preparation. And then we spend years wondering why the child is struggling. Every few generations, one escapes, not because they had good parents, not because they were protected from difficulty, because something in them, some stubborn, unkillable resistance refused to be fully absorbed, refused to stop questioning when questioning became socially dangerous, refused to look away when the crowd insisted everything was fine, refused to close the door on itself completely. Nietzsche called this the will to power. People misread it constantly. They think he meant dominance over others. He meant dominance over yourself, the capacity to impose your own form on your existence instead of accepting whatever the world presses onto you.
the ability to examine your inherited values and choose which ones you actually believe and which ones were just the watermark left by people who never examined theirs. He called the person who manages this the Übermensch, not a god, not a fantasy, just a human being who did the difficult, unglamorous, deeply lonely work of becoming themselves instead of becoming what they were told to be. This person does not emerge from safety, they emerge from friction, from being told one thing by every person around them and feeling something completely different inside, and learning, slowly and painfully, to trust the interior thing over the external noise. They emerge from being publicly wrong and surviving it, from failing and discovering that failure is not the end of everything, that the world does not collapse, that you can be humiliated and still wake up the next morning and keep moving. They emerge from the willingness to be misunderstood, by their parents, by their friends, by everyone who needs them to stay small and predictable and easy to understand. And they carry that misunderstanding without letting it convince them that they are the problem. You cannot manufacture this person by protecting them from everything that might hurt. You cannot raise a child into genuine strength by removing all friction. The attempt to do so, and this is what most modern parenting actually is, produces adults who are psychologically fragile at their core, who have been kept so safe from failure that failure has become, in their nervous systems, genuinely catastrophic, who fall apart at the first real obstacle because they never learn the thing that can only be learned by hitting the ground, that the ground doesn't kill you. So what does it actually look like to raise a child well? Not well by the standard definition, not a polite, obedient, socially acceptable human who performs adequately and never causes problems and fits neatly into the structure, but well by the measure that actually matters. It starts with letting them be wrong. Not wrong about facts, wrong in their opinions, wrong in their attempts, wrong in their early conclusions about how things work. The instinct to rescue a child from failure is powerful and understandable and destructive. A child who is always caught before hitting the ground never learns that hitting the ground ends. They carry, deep in their body, the belief that failure is permanent, fatal. And so they become incapable of genuine risk. They spend their lives playing it safe. And playing it safe, truly playing it safe, means never becoming anything real. It continues with treating their questions as real questions, not humoring them, not giving simplified answers designed to shut them up, actually engaging, actually saying, "I don't know," when you don't know, and meaning it as the beginning of something rather than the end. A household where not knowing is treated as an opportunity rather than a failure produces adults who investigate. A household where certain questions are met with discomfort, silence, or punishment produces adults who flinch before their own curiosity. It means teaching them that discomfort is survivable, that boredom is not an emergency, that the feeling of not yet knowing what you think is not a sign of stupidity. It is the actual beginning of thought. It is where thinking starts. We have built an entire culture designed to prevent people from sitting with that feeling for even 30 seconds, and then we wonder why nobody thinks anymore. It means letting them disagree with you about important things, especially about important things. The parent who meets disagreement with punishment is teaching their child that authority matters more than truth. That lesson follows the child into every relationship, every institution, every moment when they should say, "This is wrong," and they stay silent instead, because they know what happens when you say it. It means being honest about your own failures, not as emotional dumping, as evidence that failure doesn't end you. You can be broken and rebuild, that being wrong doesn't make you worthless. You can be lost and find your way. A parent who presents only competence and certainty teaches the child that competence is required and uncertainty is shameful. A parent who lets a child see them struggle and recover teaches the child that struggle is part of the process and not a verdict on their value. It means, and this is the hardest one, wanting the child to become something you didn't plan for, something that doesn't validate your choices, something that might make you uncomfortable, something genuinely other than you, and being proud of that. Even when it frightens you, even when you don't recognize them, even when who they're becoming challenges who you've been. Here's what nobody says about legacy. What you pass to a child is not primarily what you say, it is what you are, the quality of your attention, the honesty you bring to your own life, the things you refuse to look at in yourself, because they can see those too, better than you can. Children are extraordinarily accurate readers of what is actually happening versus what adults are pretending is happening. They see the gap, they just don't have language for it yet, so it lives in their bodies instead. A parent who has never questioned their own beliefs raises a child who doesn't know that beliefs can be questioned. A parent who cannot sit with uncertainty raises a child who falls apart when life gets complicated, which it always does. A parent who has never disobeyed anything, not a rule, not a social pressure, not the quiet voice that told them to be less than they could be, raises a child who obeys everything, who never makes waves, who spends their entire life trying to be acceptable, and feels beneath all the accumulated correct decisions a sourless grief. That grief is the life that was performed instead of lived. The awareness, felt but rarely examined, that they became what they were supposed to become, not what they actually were. The world is full of people like this. Not monsters, not villains, just absences, person-shaped spaces where a genuine consciousness might have developed but didn't, because it was corrected out of existence before it had a chance to take root. The question, the only question that matters, is not whether you love your children. Of course you do. Every parent loves their child. Terrible parents love their children. Love is not the variable. The question is whether your love is large enough to want more for them than your own comfort, whether it's honest enough to include an examination of what you're actually passing down, whether it's brave enough to let them become something that might not make you look good, whether it's self-aware enough to ask, am I raising this child for them or for me? And the final question, the one that should come before any of it, before the decision to bring a life into the world at all, is whether you have actually built something solid enough to bring a child into. Not perfect, not safe, but examined, intentional, honest. Nietzsche wrote, "One must still have chaos in oneself to give birth to a dancing star." Most people have chaos. That part is easy. The chaos of unexamined lives, of inherited damage, of financial instability mistaken for freedom, of wounds passed down so many generations nobody can remember where they started. The rarer thing is the person who has the chaos and the honesty to look at it, who does not pretend it isn't there, who does not pass it to a child wrapped in love and call it preparation for life. That person, if they ever choose to raise a child, raises something different. Not a mirror, not a product, not a resume item or a second chance or a validation. A person, an actual independent person with their own chaos, their own questions, their own dancing to do. And they let them. That is the whole job. That's all it ever was. Everything else is just the harm we do while pretending otherwise.